He fought one of Britain's most powerful newspapers, and lost. Now, the bill has arrived. Almost £10 million. Due immediately. And that's just the opening demand. Prince Harry isn't the only one facing this reckoning. Sir Elton John. Liz Hurley. A baroness who spent her life fighting for justice. 7 people who believed they had been wronged by the press, now standing in a London courtroom, being told they may have to pay for the very newspaper that they accused of wrongdoing. How did a case that started as an attack on tabloid journalism turn into what could become the most expensive personal defeat of Prince Harry's post-royal life? Stay with us. Because what happens next in this courtroom could shape how the Duke of Sussex is remembered for years to come. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back and look at who Prince Harry has become since he walked away from royal life. Since 2020, Harry has built a new identity for himself. Not just as a former working royal, but as a man on a very public crusade against the British tabloid press. He has said, again and again, that newspapers destroyed his childhood, hounded his mother, and made his adult life unbearable. And unlike almost every other royal in history, he chose to fight back in the one place royals almost never go, the courtroom. Over the past few years, Harry has taken on multiple British publishers. He's testified in person. He's given interviews explaining why he believes this fight matters, not just for himself, but for what he calls the broader problem of unchecked media power in Britain. One of his biggest targets has been Associated Newspapers, the publisher behind the Daily Mail, one of the best-selling papers in the country, and a media empire that has shaped British public opinion for generations. Harry didn't take on this fight alone. He was joined by a group of high-profile figures who shared his grievance: legendary musician Sir Elton John, actress and businesswoman Liz Hurley, and Baroness Doreen Lawrence, a woman already famous in Britain for her tireless campaign for justice after the murder of her son, Stephen Lawrence, in 1993. Together, these 7 claimants accused Associated Newspapers of something serious, unlawfully gathering private information about them. Phone tapping. Surveillance. Digging into their lives through methods that, if true, would have been a scandal on the scale of the phone hacking crisis that rocked British tabloids more than a decade ago. They wanted £50 million in damages. They didn't get a penny. And now, the fight isn't about whether the Mail did something wrong. It's about who pays for this legal war, and just how much it's going to cost. To really appreciate the size of this legal battle, you have to understand the scale of what Harry and his fellow claimants were trying to prove. This wasn't a simple defamation case, where someone sues because a newspaper printed something false about them. This was something much bigger, an attempt to expose what the claimants alleged was a long-running pattern of unlawful information gathering by one of Britain's most influential publishers, stretching back decades. The allegations were sweeping. Phone hacking. The hiring of private investigators. Deceptive tactics to obtain medical records, financial details, and private conversations. If proven, this would have meant Associated Newspapers had been operating far outside the boundaries of legal journalism for years, potentially rivaling the scandal that brought down the news of the world in 2011. Associated Newspapers denied every single allegation from the very beginning. The publisher called the claim sensational, unsupported, and in its own words, an attempt to drag its name through the mud without proof. This case had actually been building for years before it reached trial. Back in 2023 and 2024, courts were already wrestling with just how big and how expensive this legal fight was becoming. At one stage, both sides had proposed spending a combined total of nearly £40 million just on legal costs, before a judge even reached a verdict. A senior judge stepped in and ruled that these numbers were simply too large, ordering the claimants to bring their spending down dramatically. That should have been an early warning sign. This wasn't a normal lawsuit. This was a legal siege, and sieges are expensive for everyone involved. Then came January 2026. The trial finally began at the High Court in London, expected to run for weeks. Prince Harry gave evidence in person, appearing in court multiple times to answer questions directly. For a man who has spent years trying to distance himself from Britain's institutions, this was a striking image, the Duke of Sussex, seated in a London courtroom, being cross-examined about the very press he'd spent years condemning. Sir Elton John and Baroness Lawrence also had their claims heard, alongside Liz Hurley and several others. Each of them told their own story of alleged intrusion, each hoping the judge would find enough evidence to hold associated newspapers accountable. But evidence, as it turned out, was exactly the problem. Let's walk through exactly how this fell apart. After weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and legal argument, the case reached its climax earlier this month, when Mr. Justice Nicklin delivered his ruling. It was not close. The judge comprehensively rejected the claims brought by Harry, Elton John, and the rest of the group. He found that their evidence simply didn't hold up. The allegations of phone hacking and unlawful surveillance, the very foundation of this £50 million case, were, in the judge's words, largely speculative. Suspicion, he made clear, is not proof. And proof was exactly what the claimants had failed to provide. Prince Harry did not take the defeat quietly. He described the outcome as nothing short of a whitewash, a total cover-up dressed up as justice. It was a striking, defiant statement from a man who has rarely held back when it comes to his feelings about the British press. Associated newspapers, unsurprisingly, saw it very differently. The publisher called it a resounding victory, not just for itself, but for the principle of a free press in Britain more broadly. For years, Associated had insisted these allegations were baseless. Now, they had a High Court judgment to back them up. But here's where the story takes its next dramatic turn. Winning the case wasn't enough for Associated newspapers. Now, they wanted something else: money. A lot of it. Just weeks after that ruling, the two sides were back in the same courtroom, the Royal Courts of Justice in London, this time to fight over legal costs. And this is where things got genuinely brutal. Associated's legal team, led by barrister Anthony White, made a bold and aggressive move. They asked the judge to order costs on what's called an indemnity basis. In plain English, this means the claimants, Harry and the others, could be forced to pay not just some, but potentially the entire legal bill for both sides of this years-long legal war. And the total bill? Associated newspapers told the court its own costs alone had reached somewhere around £34 million. Let that number sink in. £34 million spent by one newspaper publisher, defending itself against 7 people. Associated wasn't just asking for reimbursement. Their barrister argued that the claimants had changed their stories throughout the case, shifting their allegations, abandoning some claims, altering others, in a way he described as unreasonable and inexcusable. He told the judge that Associated had wasted enormous amounts of time and money preparing to defend against accusations that were later dropped or changed entirely. In his view, if this kind of conduct didn't justify the harshest possible costs order, it was hard to imagine what would. And to make the financial pressure immediate, Associated didn't just ask for a final costs order somewhere down the line. They demanded an interim payment, nearly £10 million. To be paid right now, before the final costs figure is even settled. £10 million. Upfront. While the argument over the rest continues. For Prince Harry and his co-claimants, this was suddenly no longer just about losing a case. It was about the very real possibility of a devastating personal financial blow. Naturally, this story exploded across British media within hours. For tabloid critics of Prince Harry, this felt like poetic justice, the man who spent years attacking the British press now facing the possibility of paying one of its biggest publishers tens of millions of pounds. Commentators who have long argued that Harry's legal crusade was more about personal vendetta than genuine public interest pointed to this moment as proof that his case had collapsed under its own weight. On the other side, Harry's supporters saw something very different. They viewed the scale of Associated's costs demand, £34 million in legal spending, with a £10 million upfront bill, as an act of intimidation. The claimant's own legal team didn't hold back either. Their barrister, David Sherborne, argued that Associated's approach throughout this case had been one of sparing no expense, and suggested the publisher's true motive now was to make an example of the claimants, to punish them, financially, in a way that would go far beyond simply covering legal costs. Sherborne also raised a point that added real emotional weight to the proceedings. He reminded the court that these weren't faceless corporations facing this bill. These were 7 individuals. Real people, many of whom would be personally on the hook for costs that could exceed their insurance coverage entirely. People, he said, who had entered this legal fight in good faith, after decades of what they experienced as invasive and relentless media scrutiny into their private lives. It's worth pausing here to think about who these 7 people actually are. This isn't just Prince Harry. This is Baroness Doreen Lawrence. A woman whose entire public life has been built around fighting institutional failure with dignity. This is Sir Elton John, a musical icon in his 80s. This is Liz Hurley, a familiar face in British entertainment for over 3 decades. For all of them, this isn't an abstract legal argument playing out in a courtroom. It's a question of whether they now personally owe millions of pounds because a High Court judge decided their evidence wasn't strong enough. So why does this matter beyond the courtroom? For decades, the relationship between the royal family and the British press has been one of the most complicated dynamics in modern British life. Royals rely on the press for visibility, for the public affection that sustains the monarchy, but they've also been its victims, most tragically in the case of Harry's mother, Princess Diana, whose life and death were forever intertwined with tabloid pursuit. Harry has spoken many times about how growing up in that environment shaped him, watching his mother hounded by photographers, and later feeling that his own wife, Meghan, was subjected to similarly brutal media treatment. His legal battles against the press were never framed by him as simple lawsuits. He has presented them as a moral mission, an attempt to hold an industry accountable in a way no royal had dared to before. But legal experts have long pointed out the risk in that approach. British courts operate on a strict standard of evidence. Suspicion, personal conviction, even decades of lived experience with an aggressive press, are not enough on their own. You need documents. You need direct proof of unlawful conduct. And in this case, according to the judge's own ruling, that proof simply wasn't there in sufficient quantity. This is also why the concept of indemnity costs carries such weight in the British legal system. It's not the standard outcome of losing a case. Courts usually order the losing side to pay reasonable costs, an amount reviewed and moderated by the court. Indemnity costs are different. They're reserved for cases where a judge believes a losing party behaved so unreasonably during the litigation that the normal protections shouldn't apply. It's essentially a legal penalty on top of a legal defeat. That's exactly the argument Associated Newspapers put before the judge. And it's an argument that, if successful, would set a striking precedent, showing just how financially dangerous it can be to bring a high-profile case against a major newspaper and lose. For Prince Harry specifically, this adds another chapter to what has become a defining feature of his post-royal life, a series of high-stakes legal battles against the British press, some of which have gone his way, and some of which, like this one, have not. So where does this stand right now? The costs hearing at the Royal Courts of Justice began this week and was expected to run for up to 2 days, as both legal teams argued over exactly how much Harry and his co-claimants should be forced to pay, and on what basis. Notably, none of the 7 claimants appeared in court for this particular hearing. Prince Harry, Elton John, Liz Hurley, and Baroness Lawrence were all absent, with their legal representatives arguing on their behalf instead. Mr. Justice Nicklin, the same judge who delivered the original ruling against them, has not yet issued his decision on costs. That judgment is expected at a later date, and it will determine 2 crucial things. First, whether the claimants must pay costs on the harsher indemnity basis Associated is pushing for, and second, the final size of that interim payment, which, right now, sits at just under £10 million, subject to what the court considers reasonable. Until that judgment is handed down, the exact scale of Prince Harry's financial exposure remains uncertain. But even in the most conservative outcome, this case appears set to cost him and his fellow claimants a substantial sum, laid on top of an already resounding legal defeat. What started as a fight to expose alleged wrongdoing by one of Britain's biggest newspapers has become something far more personal and far more costly than Prince Harry and his fellow claimants likely ever imagined. They set out to hold Associated Newspapers accountable. Instead, they may now be the ones footing the bill, a bill that, at its current estimate, could run into the tens of millions of pounds. For Baroness Lawrence, Sir Elton John, Liz Hurley, and the other claimants, this case was never just about money. It was about believing, deeply, that they had been wronged. But in the eyes of the High Court, believing something happened and proving it are two very different things. And for Prince Harry, a man who has staked much of his post-royal identity on confronting the British tabloid press, this ruling, and the enormous bill that may follow, could become one of the most consequential setbacks of his life outside the royal family. The next chapter of this story is still being written. Mr. Justice Nicklin's final ruling on costs is still to come. And when it does, it could reshape not just Prince Harry's finances, but the way future public figures think twice before taking on Britain's tabloid press in court. So what do you think? Was this legal battle a genuine fight for justice against an unaccountable press, or a costly miscalculation that's about to leave Prince Harry with one of the biggest bills of his life? Let us know in the comments below, we read every single one. If you want to stay ahead of every twist in this ongoing royal and legal saga, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss an update the moment this story develops. And if you found this breakdown helpful, give this video a like, it genuinely helps us bring you more deep dives like this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.